Infinite Spirit, may the ideas that we share today in this meeting be those of wisdom, of grace, and of right action. In every thought, word, and act, may we show complete accord with universal law. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Alan. It's an honor to connect with you today. I'm excited about the journey we're going to embark on and what we're going to experience. I invited Alan to be on the podcast because we have a lot in common, and I'm really curious to learn more about Alan. We met somewhere along my campaign for president in 2020 as we both share libertarian values, not necessarily the ones that you see in the mainstream, but the real ones. And Alan is a thinker, and he just there's a lot about him that I appreciate, such as being very pragmatic, and that's something that he writes about, and that's something I want to talk about with him today. And he's been involved in politics and feeling called to do more from a different perspective. And so I'm hoping that this will not only be an inspiring conversation for whoever's tuning in, but also for Alan and me. So thank you again. And Alan, wondering if you'd like to, add anything to that, share a little bit about yourself and where you're at and how you got here.
Sure. No, I appreciate that opening. It really does set a good tone. I've been involved in politics for probably at least a decade now. I've been kind of, I don't know, indirectly involved for a lot longer than that, but I would say the time I first actually decided to jump in was about a decade ago. It was after I moved to Colorado. I joined the Libertarian Party because I figured after everything I had seen in the other two parties, it was just, I was politically homeless at that point, and I felt like the Libertarian Party, I might as well just give this a shot. And everyone that I met in the party at that point was just awesome. Like they seemed very intelligent and well-read and friendly, and they're live and let live type people, they just want, to be left alone kind of thing. And so I felt like I found my tribe. And so I, started doing the newsletter for them. I started doing outreach for them and stuff like that. And had a lot of fun with it, actually. I mean, one thing that people don't realize is that activism can be fun. You're actually fighting for what you believe in, and you're doing it with friends, and you're doing it with people that think like you. And so, that's some of the stuff I learned along the way. And as far as being pragmatic, I've always been pragmatic, and I've actually identified as a pragmatist since college, like over a decade ago. And so I hadn't even applied it in a political sense. I just think of myself as pragmatic minded, but I also have come to realize after talking to a lot of people about pragmatism that pragmatism doesn't often get associated with words like empathy and compassion and things like that, which is kind of a surprise to me, because I always associate pragmatism with those things, because I don't think that you can actually see both sides of an issue unless you're willing to recognize that other people have things to offer the conversation that kind of create a more balanced perspective of whatever issue it is. So like if you don't realize that there's somebody suffering from, say, substance abuse or, something like that, that you might not take into account other aspects of an issue. And I think you have to take into account all aspects of an issue if you're going to actually form a pragmatic opinion about it. And so I think the first time I really thought about pragmatism in a political context was Gary Johnson, because he was, the most prominent pragmatic-minded libertarian at the time, and probably still is if you think about it. Like, if you ask most people outside of the libertarian movement, they would probably point to Gary Johnson as being a very pragmatic individual. And, so anyway, I voted for Gary Johnson in 2016. Happily, would do it again, even though he had quite a few flubs along the campaign trail. I still think he was overall a much better candidate than, what the other parties were offering and stuff like that. So, but yeah, that's when I first started associating pragmatism with politics. And since then, I feel like libertarianism has kind of drifted a little bit further away from that. I've always felt like libertarians, the lane that we should be fighting for is the center. And I think that we're just a natural fit for the center on so many issues. And I feel like libertarianism, or certainly the Libertarian Party, has drifted away from that. And so I think that the future of the party is going to be a little bit difficult because they're not really, in my opinion, talking about issues in a very pragmatic way anymore. And I feel like it's to their detriment. And so that's where I'm at.
Thank you for sharing. That's a lot. And I had a lot of ideas and questions that you sparked in me. And, I define pragmatic, or rather, it's synonymous to me with like being logical, by not allowing your emotions to control you. But like you said, looking at the big picture and taking in as much data as you can to come up with like what's the best decision. And it's not about it's not personal, if that makes sense. Like you just, especially when it comes to politics, it's about doing like what truly is right, even though sometimes it might not seem that way, especially to somebody who is like enslaved to their emotions or polarized, like this is good, this is bad, thinking there's absolutes. And I think that's the challenge that a lot of people have, is that they're not being logical. They have the ability to, but they're just caught up in their emotions. And we see that a lot in politics. And, I haven't been following too closely what's happening with the party anymore, even though, I'm a lifetime member of California, just because like I decided like I'm going to run as an independent because of like I knew there were things going on that just didn't sit right with me because I was a delegate as well. So I got to see kind of both sides of the coin there. But I recognize like some of the things I have seen, and all the parties do this now. I mean, for the most part, at least the three major parties, is that they're trying too hard, like to please everyone, and versus like having like sticking to their principles, right? And this is not just in politics. This is like with any philosophy of life. I've noticed this. It's like a lot of people identify with a certain group, right? Like I'm a Buddhist, or I'm a Christian, or I'm a Democrat, right? Or I'm a Libertarian, but they don't necessarily live the philosophy themselves. They just say that because it sounds nice to them. So there's so much there that, and it's not always easy for me to make peace with it. Like I understand it because it's not easy to live your life following a certain philosophy, especially if you don't understand it fully. And like that was what drew me to the party initially, was because I studied all the principles of it. I'm like, this is beautiful. This is perfect. It is really about minding your own business, taking personal responsibility for yourself, voluntary action. But like perhaps it resonated with me because I came from a background of like wanting to be of service to life, and like, figuring out like how can I help people help themselves, and perhaps I think that might be where the disconnect is, that not everybody comes into that philosophy specifically of like wanting to serve life. Some people just go into it because they want to be left alone and they want to leave others alone. But I think that's the piece that's missing in perhaps in all politics, right? Like you can't force people to want to be of service to life, to do what actually benefits everyone, to recognize that like when others are thriving, you thrive more, that you don't have to win at the expense of somebody else. I mean, there's so much to this. I know I'm kind of all over the place, but like I said, you really inspired me. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that at all.
Well, you touched on principles, which I think is very important. And I think a lot of people pejoratively say that pragmatism lacks principles. Like it's just like we're just going to go with whatever deal we can make, or whatever, like, combination of things we can get accomplished. Like that's not pragmatism to me at all. Like, to me, pragmatism is like, what they're doing is they're confusing pragmatism with consequentialism, I think. And I know, not to get too abstract, but like, it really does help illustrate where I'm coming from. So you have like deontology on one hand, which they, if you've ever had these philosophical conversations about ethics, deontology is like, you believe things are right or wrong just as they are. Like that's just, things are just right or wrong. They just are. And consequentialism, it says that things are right or wrong based on the impact that it has. So like, even if you think it's the right thing to do, it's going to hurt all these people over here, so we shouldn't do it. And it's like a tug of war between those two ideologies, or not ideologies, but like perspectives, I guess you would call them. And to me, like, I'm somebody who is like deontological, but with humility. Is how I think of pragmatism. It's like, yes, I think there's right and wrong to everything, but I also understand that I'm a human being and I could be wrong about that. And I think the only way that I can understand the harm that this thing might cause, and that maybe the right thing to do isn't what I thought it was, is to listen to other people and hear their stories and hear how, this thing that I think is perfectly fine might actually impact all these other things in the world. And so I think it's always important to have humility. And so, yes, I do think pragmatism is very logical, in the sense that you're thinking about all of this, you're putting it all in front of you in your mind's eye, and you're trying to suss it out. But I also think that, evolution has given us these skills to determine truth, and one of those involves emotion. And I think Matt Ridley, if you want to know more about this, Matt Ridley wrote a book called On the Origin of Truth, and I think he talks about where does this come from, this mechanism that, like, sadness and anger and all of these things, why do we even have them? And the reason is it allows us to identify with other people. Like, their experience cannot be communicated to us, except this is one of the ways that their experience can be communicated to us, and that's information. So being able to recognize that, even if you're not personally feeling what they're feeling, you can recognize it, and that can inform your opinion as well. To me, it's just additional information about whatever this subject is. So to me, I don't think you can be truly pragmatic unless you're taking in all the information, and that is just one piece of information. So,
thank you. You got me curious about a couple things. The idea of right and wrong, and also about the impact of perception. And with right or wrong, I've been having this conversation a bit lately with people on my own, and it's I think about a father who, let's say he's just down on his luck, doesn't have a job, barely getting by, has children to feed though, and they're starving, and he shoplifts at the grocery store. Was that right or wrong if he was doing it to feed his children, right? Could it be both? Is there really an absolute, and it's just, for some things it isn't black and white like that, right? Like, I think you would agree with that. It's like, if your children are starving and you just you don't have the level of awareness or intelligence to figure out another solution, that's the best you can come up with, right? Because we're all different. Yeah. Some of us would figure out a way out of it without having to steal from somebody, right? But do we fault him for not knowing any better?
Yeah.
It's just, there's a lot, to consider there. It's like recognizing everybody's in a different place, and why it's important not to judge and to recognize people are just doing the best that they can with, their level of understanding, their level of intelligence, and it's not their fault. There are, we can educate ourselves more, we can expand our understanding and our awareness. But those things take time. And typically, even though we have the ability to stimulate ourselves from within, many of us are stimulated by what's without, right? Like something
Mhm.
happens in the external world, it's like, oh, that's inspiring me to go change or take action versus thinking I can just change on my own, because I want to. So I'm these are not easy conversations because I realize
Yeah.
like it's I'm thinking out loud that I appreciate this and thinking about perception, in relationship to emotion. That's something I've been working on a lot and understanding like why do I feel certain ways at this time, especially like I want to understand like my negative emotions, why do I feel, fear or or depressed or angry or whatever, right? And I recognize it has to do with my perception of an experience, right? Or something I've witnessed. And that if I change my perception, that I can have a different emotion come from it. So it's made me realize like emotions are really subjective. And again, this is where like getting in the bigger picture really helps. Like, a lot of times when something happens to us that throws us off in a negative way, we're not taking in the bigger picture. And like as time goes by, we can go back and look at that and it's easier to recognize, oh, maybe this wasn't so bad. Maybe this was actually really good for me. I just didn't see it then. So it's interesting how these things are subjective and yet, a lot of people are swayed to make like big decisions because of these subjective emotions and because of this subjectivity around right or wrong, back to politics, policies that are made, laws that are made. A lot of them are based on these subjective um, beliefs, experiences, for lack of a better word, that people are having, and they're not really necessarily beneficial. It's just, people are responding to oftentimes who's the loudest, who's the most emotional, who's the most threatening versus like what makes the most sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people feel nowadays like they're not being heard. And I think that that's why a lot of the anxiety and stress in politics exists, is because like we have a system that rewards deal makers, and like the only thing that matters in politics is, do you have the votes? And if you have 50% plus one, that's enough to get whatever you want passed. And it might not even be what the 50% plus one even wants, because they had to make all these deals just to get the 50% plus one, but the other 49% is just left out in the cold and nobody's happy, And this is why I think we should move more towards consensus building as an approach in all aspects of life, because I think deep down, most people want the same things. And I know people say that, people talk about that like it's a cliche, but it's like it's in the data. If you ask people individually on issues like the drug war and things like that, they tend to fall like within the same, mindset. And I think that that's very interesting, because I think it means that we're not doomed. I'm an optimist. I actually do believe that, most people want the right thing. And you know, I think it's important for everyone to have a moral compass, and if there's slight variations in that, that's completely understandable. We all have our own life experiences, and it's going to shape what we think of as being right and wrong. But the only way we're going to get ahead is if we understand and have humility about the fact that we are individuals with our own unique personal experiences that aren't shared by others. Like, we just have to understand that, like, other people matter and their opinions matter. Even if you think they're completely wrong, their opinions matter. And the only way we get ahead is if we actually bring everybody to the table to talk about the things that we disagree on, because you might find that if you change your approach just a little bit, to away from being, we're just going to get enough votes to pass what we want to pass, to we got to really put our heads together and figure out a solution that everyone's happy with, because we need to put this to bed. We can't just keep arguing about this topic for years and years and years and just never, and people are just always unhappy. Like, it is possible, I think, to change our perspective just slightly to actually make change. And I'm not saying that I'm speaking from experience there. I'm just saying I believe that it is possible and we should work towards it.
I really appreciate that. And that's kind of one of the things I always try to do is bring people together and find like the common ground. And I appreciate what you said about, looking at the data and how we really share a lot of the same desires, like, in what we want out of life and, our values and so forth. And I think part of it is, just it's like this football mentality, pick a team, and your side is bad and my side is good versus like, well, you know what, like my side's not perfect, your side's not perfect. Let's just take the stuff that's good from all sides and leave behind what doesn't, versus like this strong need to want to be right at all costs, even if you're not really right. And that's really dangerous. And that's part of the reason I'm doing this podcast, is to like inspire people to talk to other people, to recognize like, hey, we have a lot more in common than you might think we do, even though we might look different and do very different things in life. Might have different, might vote differently politically, might have different, spiritual beliefs or none at all, which is a belief, but at the end of the day, I mean, I think about like, what does everybody really want? I think, we all want to feel peace. We all want to feel safe. We all want to feel love. We want to have faith that, tomorrow is going to be better, but it needs to be grounded in logic, because even if we're not doing it at a conscious level, people can sense like when something is amiss, and worry and fear takes over them, which leads to, making not the best decisions. So it's definitely something I aspire to, help make a positive impact in, is, to help bring people together more and to recognize like how much we have in common. Yeah, it's funny. I'm in a community of leaders, so to speak. I don't know. It's just being developed. So I don't know what we are officially, but a friend requested somebody in the group, and I didn't even remember that apparently we didn't agree with each other on something, and he wrote me a message that he was surprised I added him. I'm like, I don't hold any grudges. I don't take anything personally. I love all people, even if I don't know them, even if I don't agree with them. I'm sure we have a lot more in common than we don't. And that's really, how I view it. And I want diversity around me, because that's how we learn. If I surround myself with people who are always agreeing with me, how am I going to grow? How am I going to learn? I want to be challenged, and I appreciate that, even if it makes me uncomfortable sometimes. Like that's where growth happens. It's not because everything's always comfortable and easy. And it's dangerous if we just surround ourselves with people that always say yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, last night I was watching another video that I think I had seen like years ago, but it was a TED Talk on consensus building, and I was like, I want to just go back and revisit this, because I remember this person making a point that I really wanted to go back and I do this a lot, where I'm like, my memory as I get older is just mush these days, so I'm like, I have to go back and rewatch stuff just to remember. Oh yeah, okay, that was that. I do agree with that point still. Okay, past me agrees with future me. But anyway, she was making a point about like there was a problem, like a made up problem about a town that had an excess of bananas, and what were they going to do about it? And they had like 3 solutions, and nobody liked them. Nobody liked any of those solutions. And it wasn't until in this made up example that they reached out and brought more people in, and because they did that, there were all these people that had all these different things to add to the problem, and so they ended up having a much better solution. They found out there's a zoo next in the next town over that has a new monkey exhibit, and they've got all these like monkeys that need bananas, and it's like a way of basically saying, like, if you bring more people in, you'll have more ideas about how you can solve the problem. And so, yeah, the diversity of thought is incredibly important whenever you're problem solving. So, like, theoretically, the bigger the group is, the better the solution you should be able to come up with, because you will have access, you'll literally just have access to more ideas. And so eventually you can whittle it down to something that everybody's happy with. So
The challenge of that, though, is there's so many of us,
yeah,
right? Like, how do we determine how many people get hurt? And obviously, like, we have
yeah,
representatives and stuff like that in government. Because I'm against growing the government. I'm for shrinking the government. Because I find that the bigger the government gets, the more control they have over our lives, and that's really not ideal. We should be coming together as communities, again,
yeah,
voluntarily, helping each other out, not being dependent on the government for things we can do ourselves. And when we are talking to each other and coming together as communities, we're more involved, right? We understand more of what's going on versus like reading on the ballot what it is, right? And that a lot of times is misleading. There's something else that you said a little bit ago that you reminded me of this last time you spoke, which is really huge, and I'm realizing is a lot of people just want to be heard.
mm-hmm.
And like what I mean by that is like some people just want to tell you what's bothering them and what they've been going through, and they're not necessarily looking for you to do anything about it,
Yeah,
right? And that's something that we can offer anybody, but it does require presence, just to because people can tell when you're paying attention to them and when you're not. And I think that a lot of issues in the world would be gone if we just stopped and listened to people who are suffering, who are in pain, and let them get it off of their chest. Because a lot of times, just the act of doing that changes them. It makes them feel
mm-hmm.
lighter. It's like, oh, I don't have to carry this around anymore. It's incredible just acknowledging that and sharing that with others. The transformation that can come from that. And obviously, there are some people that are looking for solutions too. But I want to mention that because that's something I've been experiencing a lot in my life lately, where people are sharing like really heavy stuff with me. And I recognize they don't want anything from me except for just to hold the space for them and to be present, to acknowledge, like, yeah, they went through some really hard times. But they're okay. They made it to
Yeah,
the other side. And it's just like empathy, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
I can give you a very practical example of what you just said. It doesn't even have to be this theoretical, Congress group of people. It's retail. In my day job, I manage a game store, and so one thing that I'm telling people whenever I train them on how to be a supervisor or a manager is how to deal with escalated guests, people who are very upset, and it's really quite simple. Like, there's one thing you need to do, and I guarantee you, if you do this every time, if anybody out there is in a manager position of any kind, and you have to deal with upset customers or whatever, the one thing you need to do before you do anything else is convince the customer that you give a shit. Right? Like, convince them that you care. Because once you do that, it almost doesn't matter if you can solve the problem, because like you might go into a situation and know for a fact I cannot help this person, but I'm going to do my very best to convince them that I actually care about this problem. Probably the worst situation I've ever heard of is when I was working at Walgreens. Somebody who was working in the photo department, I guess the printer jammed or something, and all of this customer's wedding photos were destroyed. And I'm like, how do you talk to that customer and calm them down? Because like at that point, they do have a problem, and it is your fault in a sense. I mean, you could say it's an accident, but like they don't care about that. Like this is one of their most cherished moments in their life, just gone. And how do you talk to that customer? The only way you can do it is if you have empathy. And even then, they're going to be upset, but you need to understand that like they have a right to be upset sometimes anyway. And, yeah, the most important thing is you have to convey to them that you actually care about their problem. Even if you don't, you have to convince them. And then once you do that, the conversation will be a lot better. And I can't tell you how many times I've done that personally, where like the customer's very upset and they have every right to be upset. But by the time they leave, they're thanking me profusely for helping them and all this other stuff. And it's all in that one little adjustment that you make where you're convincing them that you care about their problem, and that, yeah, that's the key.
Yeah, you're taking personal responsibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're also just giving them what they want, acknowledging
Yeah.
what they're feeling. Um, Shucks, I had another thought, but it just slipped me. But no, before that, before you gave this example of the married couple, I was thinking about uh, um, where am I going right now? Sorry, I just spaced out. Children acting out. Yes.
Mm.
Because you're just stimulating me a lot, and there's something really personal that I was thinking about. That's why I'm a little spacey here. Something happened this weekend that was pretty serious, and I had the police involved. And
Mm.
it was somebody that was mentally unwell, acting out in the middle of the street and threatening people, and
Oh,
grown
wow.
man. But I recognize like it's very similar to, adults as children acting out, whether we're mentally well or not. Like, why do we act out? Why do we throw tantrums? Because we're not getting our needs met, because we're not getting the attention we want. And oftentimes, again, that's all we need to do is recognize somebody, and like if we need to take personal responsibility, even if it isn't always our responsibility, like it probably wasn't your fault if those photos were gone forever, but
Yeah.
you represented the business, so that was why you did that, and that was the right thing to do to appease the situation. um, but I also think about then there's like people like me that um, really do their best to practice non-attachment, and when things don't go my way, even though it's not what I wanted, I learned to find something positive out of it so that it doesn't get the best of me, because I've learned like, okay, if I get emotional in a negative way, it's going to create all these toxic chemicals in my body, and that creates disease. So why am I going
Mm.
to let something that's like out of my control knock me off and affect me in a negative manner, like this issue this weekend? Um, yeah, that was my thing. I'm like, yeah, I didn't feel safe for a moment, but I did the right thing, and then I moved on. I talked it over
Mm.
with my husband. I decided, like, are we going to press charges? Are we going to get a restraining order? What are we going to do? And we decided a report was okay in this instance. Um,
Mm.
and then we moved on. It's like, we're not going to live in fear. We're not going to get upset. Like, we understand this person's not well. Um, and so I just share that because, like, there are alternatives to people that find themselves in situations where their wedding pictures are destroyed. And,
Yeah.
it isn't the end of the world, right?
Yeah.
You could find something positive out of that experience, and if you try, or just to recognize like nothing lasts forever, and you have the experiences embedded in the cells of your body. So there's a lot to it, and like I really aspire to do that with all circumstances. Like, don't let things outside of me knock me down. Do my best to be present and to adapt intelligently and move on with it with something positive, at the very least, a lesson.
Yeah. And I should clarify, by the way, I did not have to deal with that couple. That was just, I was working there when that happened. And I was like, thank God that's not me. That has to deal with that.
Yeah.
Um,
But no, I used to sell exotic cars like Bentleys and Lamborghinis, and I would have clients come in like multimillionaires and throw tantrums because, their car wasn't ready on time for, or something like that. It's like, it's just a car, you know?
mm,
And it was just like, wow, really? Like, you're that
yeah.
attached to like you'll be fine. But it just like, and it's just like, I guess for me, this is kind of tapping into a conversation I've been having lately as well about like our values and the things that upset us. Cause I see people that like punch walls and like want to have a fight because like they broke something, that's worth like maybe $5.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, like, why would you allow that to affect you in such a negative way? Like, don't you understand the consequences of what you're doing to yourself?
Yeah.
Um,
It comes down to emotional intelligence. I think a lot of people don't realize how lacking they are in emotional intelligence, because they haven't taken enough time to consider, you know, they haven't taken enough time to process their own emotions, much less other people's emotions. So, in the example with the couple in the wedding photos, like, you have to be like one of the most profound stoics to be able to go into that situation and go, I understand why they're hurting and why they're upset and blah, 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 but I have to be strong and take responsibility and, yeah.
I appreciate that, because as you were saying that, I was thinking, yeah, even though I choose to respond differently to things that happen that are out of my control, it doesn't mean that I give others a hard time for responding however they choose.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't make it better for them. Like, to tell them, oh, you can respond this way, if they're not ready to hear it. And that's really
Yeah.
important to recognize, because I think in the past, I may have hurt some people's feelings unintentionally by saying stuff like that. And now I'm a lot more compassionate about it, recognizing, you know what, like, that's where they're at, and don't add fuel to the fire, unless they're asking for an alternative sincerely. Like, some
Yeah.
people just want to vent.
As I get older, I find myself in situations like that a lot, where I'm like, I see somebody's really upset about a thing that I was upset about like 10, 15 years ago, like for the same reason and with the same energy. And I'm like, I've been there. I understand why you're upset.
Yeah.
I got through it. And if it were to happen again, I would not bring the same energy to the situation, but but I understand. Like, I have it, like, I have that emotional intelligence now to recognize they're upset for this reason, and I was upset for the same reason back then, and so I get it. So I feel like you're in a better position to help that person,
Yeah.
And I feel like if people are a little bit more conscious about when they change internally and being able to recognize that in the world, I feel like they, have an opportunity to actually help people,
Yeah. Well, and also those experiences helped you to get to where you are today, the same way they will help others get to, a higher level of consciousness and more emotional intelligence, where they're not so sensitive to everything happening. Yeah. So I'm curious, like, what led you to this place? Like, why did you decide to approach life differently? Like, is there something that, like, a pivotal moment in your life, some kind of experience, or was it gradual?
Yeah, I guess I would say it was gradual. My views have always changed throughout my life. Like, just to use my spirituality as an example, I used to be a very devout, like, I think in high school, I was a very devout Christian, Pentecostal. Don't judge me. It was just a thing. It was a phase. Don't judge me. But, then I went through, my atheistic phase, I guess you'd say, just before I went to college. And then during college, I actually started studying the Bible a lot more. And I eventually wound up on my own path, I guess you would say. Like, I would be considered a heretic in most churches. I just would. Doesn't mean I'm evil. I mean, I guess I guess I would consider myself a Christian, but not an Orthodox Christian, if that makes sense. Because, like,
Yeah. Well, I think there's like a, I don't know what the right word is. There's churchianity and there's Christianity.
there you go. There you go. Like, my views, I guess you'd say to most Christians, they'd be pretty radical. Like, if you were to tell me that, yes, there was a man named Jesus who existed and he did all these things, but he didn't actually get resurrected. He didn't actually ascend to heaven. It wouldn't change what I believe, but I still follow the teachings of Jesus because I think they're good teachings. And I think that, from a very symbolic standpoint, they're important, and they're there's a lot of truth in that. But, like, if you were to say that to most Christians, like, that's the basis of their faith, is like, if you don't believe that this man was resurrected and went to heaven or whatever, then you're not a Christian. And I'm like, I don't really feel that way. I don't like, and I'm only using that as an example to say, like, my views are very kind of, it's a mixed bag, I guess you'd say.
Yeah. Well, if you're comfortable, I'd like to kind of share something like about the Bible where I think it creates a lot of
Sure.
confusion. Like in churchianity, what most people hear in their churches isn't the full Bible. It's what's been handpicked for them. But if they were to go
Mm-hmm.
through the whole thing, they'd find like there are stories in there that conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Like this doesn't make sense, but it's because there's a deeper meaning to it. They're not all meant to be taken literally. And also like to remember, like this was written by human beings that were just as imperfect as me and you trying to figure this out. It wasn't written by Jesus, it wasn't written by Moses. Um,
Yeah.
all these great religions around the world weren't written by the people they were founded around, right?
Yeah.
And so, like you talked about heaven, that was, one of the things that kind of made me think, oh, I want to, see if I can go here with you. Jesus, this is in the Bible, told the Pharisees that God's kingdom, heaven, is within. It's not up there. It's not down there. It's not in the afterlife or someplace. It's a state of being, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, a lot of people seem to have missed that. And it was a very big point. And Jesus isn't quoted in the Bible very often, and that's one of the places where he was quoted. So I think there's significance to that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a lot like you, where I really appreciate studying it and trying to understand, like, what does this really mean? Like, I forget what book it's in, but there's a battle going on where um, somebody asked God to like stop the sun so they can have more light. Well, that's like totally symbolic to me. Like, well, what is light? Light is knowledge. Like we all want more light. We all want more knowledge, and that's why it's like, duh, the sun doesn't move.
Mm-hmm.
And people say, oh, it's flawed because of that. Like, people aren't understanding. Like, these are very esoteric stories. Like, you have to understand what is the meaning behind it versus taking it literally. Stop the sun for me, or the four corners of the earth. Like all these things are being lost in the desert for 40 years and it's super tiny. Like this isn't literal. Like this is a much deeper story, but it's told that way so people of all levels of understanding can get something out of it. Right. And that's the thing, like understand back to like understanding where people are and the difference where you are and like recognizing like that's part of their journey too. And it's okay if that's all they understand right now. Like they need that to be able to get to a different place. And the other thing, like I don't know, it hasn't always been easy for me to accept, even though I get it at a conscious level, is like not everybody is going to evolve as much in consciousness in their lifetime. Like we all evolve different amounts and we all have different like parts to play, but that doesn't mean that somebody is less or more valuable. Like everybody really does matter. And we're all here for a reason. And if, anything changes, like if you have a different thought, all of a sudden it affects everybody. If you do something differently today, it affects everybody. It ripples. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot to consider with the Bible and understanding like people's behavior.
Yeah, your mind is just as scattered as mine is, I feel. Like or not scattered, but like I don't know. I find it just as challenging to look at all of these different variables and figure out what makes the most sense when you combine them all. And I guess that's the clearest way I can say it, is that if you're a real truth seeker, you're eventually going to be walking your own path at some point. And that doesn't mean that you should be disconnected from the world, obviously. Like there's an element of hubris to the idea that, yes, I walk my own path, like you should be humble always, but like you can also, take a little pride in the fact that, you've spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff in a way that most people don't. Most people don't take as critical of an eye to these things. And that's why I brought up the spirituality thing, because it's like, every aspect of my life, like whether it's art or it's my friends and family or it's politics or whatever it is, I try to look at all the variables and pick a course forward, and it's easier said than done, because it really does mean that you might be alone in your thinking. And, if you're going to go that way with it, you need to accept that and just be comfortable knowing that I might be completely alone in this thinking. But, as long as you're being humble with it and making sure that you're exposing yourself to as much information as possible, like I do that on a regular basis. Like if I see something that is like this monolithic, zeitgeist type idea that everybody just accepts to be true, I'm the weirdo that will go and pick it apart just to see. And it's not that I think deconstructionalism is like a principle that I follow, but it's more of an approach, like I'm not going to deconstruct it because I think that deconstructing things in its own right is a virtue. Like sometimes things are right and wrong. Like I said, like I think maybe this is just right, and there's no reason to pick it apart and destroy it just for the sake of doing that, and that's very popular nowadays to do. Like you take any tradition or belief system or whatever, and you just deconstruct it for the sake of deconstructing it. And then what happens at the end of that? You just toss it in the waste bin and acknowledge that, oh yes, people are flawed and our belief systems are probably also flawed, and they are not flawed, but maybe incomplete or insignificant, whatever. So just
Yeah.
approaching every topic with a well-rounded, view, and being humble about it, I think you just have to find a balance. And I'm not necessarily found that balance, but I try to.
Well, you touched on a lot there. And like, I don't believe in taking away something that's working for somebody else, essentially,
Yeah.
just because it doesn't work for me with the deconstruction. And you reminded me of the word I was looking for with the Walgreens story, and that was humility. It was
Yeah.
about taking a personal responsibility and having humility. So I wanted to throw that back in there.
Yeah.
And then also thinking about being alone in thought. One of the things that I found has been really helpful, especially like um, growing up when the internet was just coming out, being able to connect with like-minded people all over. We're not limited anymore to like who's physically around us, and recognizing we aren't really alone in thought. And like if you're having an idea, somebody else is probably having that idea too. Um, and so that I'm not necessarily looking for connection, but I used to always kind of put myself out there. Like I would be in like chat rooms back in the day, and like even like phone chat lines, or I put personals in the paper, but like just looking for people that were similar like me. And now there's the internet, and I used to go and seek people, and now I don't really do that because I realize like I've got a full plate and they'll find me. But
Yep.
it's nice to have that, to recognize like we can find people that think like us, and if we want to. But again, like back to earlier, like don't create an echo chamber, because it's important to have that contrast to challenge our own thinking. And and because we might be wrong, like, and we usually are about a lot of things. I'm still learning all the time. And you've kind of touched on this, and it's coming up now for me again. I think it's not easy for most of us to admit like when we've been wrong. and
Yeah.
and and like I don't hold, like I mentioned earlier, grudges against anybody, so there's just nothing to forgive. Like anything anybody's ever said or done towards me, like whether it was intentional or not, to harm me or what, like there's no grudges. Like I get it, they're just doing what they thought was right. um but I think that's hard because a lot of people do hold grudges and don't want to forgive. And I think that's what creates that fear, where and that stunts our relationships, that stunts our growth when we're not able to do that. Like I don't know what you believe about what's been happening the past few years around COVID, but it's really interesting how a lot of the news these days is basically coming out saying that a lot of the conspiracy theories are actually true. And so I'm, wondering if like the people that like ended relationships around that are going to come back and say, I'm sorry, or they're going to just have pride get in the way, and keep a wedge between them and people that were like family or close friends. And I really hope that people do decide to be like, um, I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. I'm sorry I treated you this way. said these things to you, like I learned from this, and hopefully they really do, like, hey, you know, we can't just trust like somebody in authority positions to know it all, because again, we're all human, nobody has the answers. Anyway, I hope that's okay to talk about a little
Yeah, no,
bit.
it's fine. It makes me think of like this idea that people need permission to admit that they're wrong. And it's this concept that I've been thinking about the last couple of years specifically, not necessarily in terms of COVID, but like, you know, when if somebody's talking to you and you know they're wrong, um, most people would just fight them and be like, no, you're wrong. And or they might even resort to like ridicule and mockery and all of this stuff. Um, but of course, none of that has ever changed anyone's mind, right? Like, when have you ever had your mind changed by somebody making fun of you? You know, like that doesn't work. Um, and so, like, but what does often work is um, phrasing things in such a way that you're giving them an out. Like, well, certainly you don't mean this, you know, like, or maybe what you meant was this. Did you mean this? Like, you know, like you're giving them an out. You're giving them a way to save face. And, you know, I find that and most people are not really skilled or trained at doing that. And I would count myself in that, but it's just something that if you want to find a way to, you know, actually persuade people and get them to realize that they're wrong on something, and it works for you too, like, you know, I found that, like, and I think the reason I think this or am aware of it is because some people have had the good grace to do it with me. You know, they give me an opportunity to be like, yeah, you know what, maybe that is wrong. Maybe my thinking on that is not quite accurate. You know, like, I'm fond of Benjamin Franklin was very well known for always ending conversations or changing the topic by saying, you might have a point, or you might be right about that. You know, because that way you're not really saying you're right. You're just acknowledging that I kind of don't, like, I care more about our friendship than I do about us arguing about this, you know? And it's like, I'm willing to accept that you might be right, you know? And just saying that is a big deal, you know?
Mm. I appreciate that. Yeah, whenever I have conversations about like things that are kind of hot in the news, I don't take a side with people, you know. I say I don't know. You know, this is what's being told to me, but I'm not picking a side. I don't know the reasons why this is happening, or, you know, because the latest was the balloon thing, you know. I don't know if it was an accident or not. I just know that there's a balloon out there and we spent a lot of money shooting it down and other ones.
Yeah.
You know, and I try to really stick to the facts. And yeah, with the COVID thing, like a lot of people came to me and asked me what I thought. I said, you know, you've got to decide what's right for you. You know, I'm not here to influence people. I'm here to make my own decisions for myself. And I think like that was a good approach, but I appreciate your approach where you're giving people an out. Um, and yeah, because typically, I mean, I have learned this in the past that like when we agree with people that want to argue with us, it actually gets them to think about their argument.
Yeah, and there is something to be said for the charity principle. Like, I literally just tweeted about this yesterday about, like, you know, for those who don't know about the charity principle, it is, if you're debating with somebody, you should always start with the most charitable interpretation of what they're saying. Even if you think they're saying something else, you should be like, are you saying this? You know, because then we can talk about that, you know. Whereas most people will go with the most radical, crazy interpretation of whatever somebody's saying, just so that they can beat them and show that they humiliate them. And it's not productive. It further divides, and it, you know, you can tell, like, I'm getting really good at being able to tell, like when I listen to people do interviews or talk on podcasts, like, podcasters are notorious in their thought patterns being adversarial and unproductive. Like, they're always approaching every issue in this sort of, I don't know, macho way. Like, I'm here, I believe what I believe, now you got to convince me that I'm wrong. Go. You know, and it's just so, like, like it's not conducive to an actual productive conversation. And, I would caution anybody when you're listening to a podcast or watching a video on YouTube or whatever, just think about that. Like, how does this guy think? How do they actually approach discussion and debate? Are they actually being open-minded, or are they just, waiting for the punchline? They're waiting for their turn to talk so that they can be right.
Mm.
And it's just something that I've noticed, and also in my real life too. Like, I've noticed that some people are like that, and I guess now I kind of navigate that relationship differently. If I know that you're the sort of not necessarily narcissistic behavior, but like kind of like that, where you're not really engaging with somebody who wants to engage with you. Like, it's almost like you're talking to a character in a video game. Like they've got a script. They're going to give you a quest and send you off on your quest, but that's their only purpose. Like, they're not actually there to talk to you. They're not a real character. It's weird to talk about people in that way, but like sometimes that's how they act. They act like, they're just waiting for their turn to talk. And when you find that you're engaging with people who just do that on a regular basis, I just engage with those people less, because I feel like at the end of the day, I'm going to value the input from that conversation less, because I feel like they're not actually putting the same energy into it that I'm putting into it. So,
Yeah, I appreciate that. And like, I do my best to remind people to not take anything that I say like as a fact, because, I'm human. I'm not perfect. And I know, like, I admit, like, when I've been mistaken about something, or like why I've made different decisions in the past than I do today. Um, like a couple things come to mind. Like, I used to be a Democrat, and, why I subscribe that philosophy and why I don't anymore. Same with Libertarian, Also, like, I used to think that I had a soul, and now I believe I am a soul. And it's like recognizing that we change as we learn more, and our belief changes that. And that's part of the reason why it's so important to question everything that somebody tells you. Don't just, you know, put somebody on a pedestal and think that, oh, this person knows it all. I don't need to think for myself. I'm just going to believe what they tell me they believe. And that's really dangerous because, again, nobody has all the answers. And that's, again, like what you were talking about earlier, why we need to come together and share more ideas. And the more we do that, the more we will get closer to the truth. But it's not like one person has it all figured out. Some of us, I think, more so than others, but I think like the ultimate knowing is knowing that just I am. That's it.
Yeah.
Just to go super esoteric, but in a way, I know it's not an answer or, statement that a lot of people like, but it's like, that's it. That's all I really know is I am.
Well, you're speaking my language, because like if there's a word that I would use to describe my spirituality, it would be Gnostic. It's probably the closest approximation to what I believe. Though if you were to look it up, you'd be like, really? He believes all this stuff? No, not all of it. But like, I do generally believe in, what they call the sacred flame, the idea that we all have the spark of divinity within us, and that we can either nurture it and grow it, or we can snuff it out, and things like that. And that, I think, a lot of soul searching and introspection and stuff like that, if you work them into your daily life, you'll find inner truth. And that inner truth can be so powerful. It could be your entire purpose for existing here on the planet. Like, and I'm still figuring that out. but yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from on a lot of this, is like, I don't really know the answers, but I know that, I'm learning more every day on every subject that I set my mind to. And the most important information I get is from other people talking to me. Like, there are things that I once believed that I don't believe anymore because people convinced me. Like, that's, you're leaving some things out. And I think that that's why I've always struggled with this, like the idea of nihilism, for instance. I've always rejected it. And I see the appeal because it kind of seems like when you look under every rock, what you find is more questions, and more mystery. And it's like, is there just this incessant need from people to just do that? And are we just this endless quest of looking for meaning? Is it just pointless? And maybe we should just conclude like we're just making it up, and that like there's an appeal to nihilism, I think. And I've actually heard some pretty impassioned arguments about it that argue that it's not actually a philosophy of despair or anything like that. But I would never count myself as a nihilist, because I think that the world is too beautiful. It seems very clearly designed. It seems like there's a reason why we're here. And I just feel it in my bones. Like I just, on a very deep intuitive level, it doesn't make sense to me. So, yeah.
Well, there's a reason that we're not like other animals, right? Like there's a reason that we can reason inductively and deductively, and that we can originate new chains of causation versus, being enslaved to instinct and, no inward thinking. The animal doesn't know, like, I am whatever, I am. Like, I know I am Sorinne and you are Alan. But then I also think about, like, when you look at like how huge like the universe is and everything we know about what's out there beyond Earth, and how tiny we are, it's a balancing act to try to figure out, like, am I really that significant or am I not, right? And when I mean I don't mean I as an individual. I mean the human race, right? The human species. There's a lot that comes with it, but it's not a mistake that we're able to do all these things that other animals and other life forms can't, and yet we also can do all the things that they can do, but they can't do what we can do. So everything's happening by law, but it's just like, I don't know if we'll ever really know. I think it's all going to be theoretical. Mm-hmm. Especially because like nobody can say what comes next.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also think there's something to be said for creating our experience, because like my Gnostic understanding of the world suggests that, everything emanated from what they call the pleroma, which is a fancy word. It just means like there was a thing that all of this emerged from, and it's almost like we're creating each new emanation from the original source. And so like, I think, there's the individual experience that we all have physically in this world, but there's also the, I guess, metaphysical experience, which is like the closest I've come to reading about this would be the Cloud of Unknowing. If you've ever read that, it's like, are you familiar with this? It's like this great where I think it was written by a monk, and it's like a devotional. It's like one of these very big famous devotionals, which will teach you how to like literally go inside yourself by negating the world around you, because you basically cannot have two things happening at once inside you, where you're thinking about the world but you're also thinking about the divine. You just can't do them at the same time. And so it kind of walks you through how to like negate the world in your mind, I guess that's how you would say it, but only for the purpose of devotion. Like you're it's almost like you're closing yourself off, creating this bubble, and you're going inside yourself, that kind of thing. And so there's two aspects of us as people, and there's that aspect, but there's also the individualist aspect of our existence. Like we have a fragmented existence for a reason. I don't know what that is, but like you are you, I am me, and that there's a reason for that. Like we're not the same person. We have different experiences, and the reason behind that, I don't really know what it is, but I just know that I feel like there's a push and pull between those two aspects of who we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a theory I subscribe to where we're all different degrees of the same thing, meaning like we're all different expressions of the creator, the divine, whatever you want to call it. And also, I think it's in Bhakti Yoga where, they believe everybody and everything is divine. And so, like, I personally try to view the entire world as divine. So that's like another, way of viewing things. So I can think about the world and the divine at the same time if I think of it as one. But, this like I subscribe to oneness versus duality, although I do recognize we're here in these separate forms for a reason. But it is like one of my friends, he sent me an image once of like a hand underneath a tablecloth, and all you see are these fingers, right? And they're separate. But then you look under the cloth, it's like it's all the same thing. It's just the illusion of separateness.
Yeah.
But there's a lot again, like I'm not trying to push like a certain way of thinking, but it does get me thinking when I look at different ideas to consider. It's like, oh, and it makes it easier to love people that I might not necessarily be in resonance with to recognize like we're here doing different things for a reason. Like, um, in Brahmanism, and now I think it's considered Hinduism. There's Shiva and Vishnu, the creator and the preserver, and you need both for balance. And in our bodies, we have anabolism and catabolism, and we need both for balance. And so
Yeah.
that's something, that I really do my best to make peace with because like I might not like when somebody is being destructive, but I have to recognize like they're playing whatever part was assigned to them, especially if it's something that fulfills them. For me, it's not fulfilling. So I know what side I'm on. And again, it's like I try not to pass judgment because it's like that's where they're at. And maybe at another point in their life, they'll be doing something else. They'll go to the other, polarity. And because there was a time in my life when I was destructive too, especially when I was younger, and self-destructive. So it's interesting to consider all these things, how life ebbs and flows and how we can express ourselves in different ways throughout our lives. And it's like nothing is static, right? Everything changes,
Mhm.
everything's dynamic. And to recognize that, it brings me peace. It's like I'm not stuck here. If I don't like where I'm at today, I know it's going to be different tomorrow or even later today. It's just a matter of time and focusing on what I want and directing my energy in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, we are creating our experience together. And that's sounds like some kind of frou-frou new age silliness, but it's literally true. It just is. It and then if you think about it in that way, it's like there's no one driving the ship. It's like we're making the experience happen. And I can imagine that, that there's a creator that knows how this will all end, but I can also imagine the opposite of that because like I said, if we're literally creating this together and that's all it is, then you know, I almost feel like it's a waste of time to think about it in that way. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm with you because again, it's theoretical. Like,
yeah,
why not just be here and
yeah.
figure out who you are and what you're capable of and make the most out of life? Yeah. Alan,
Uh,
like, wow, I'm just really blown away by this conversation. I'm really appreciating how just going back and forth with you because I have been kind of in a lot of different places and bringing them together, and it's nice to engage with someone that can keep up.
mhm.
I'm wondering if there's anything else that you would like to add to the conversation before I go into the closing concept.
I think we touched on a lot. I think for me, um, I I really think what we were talking about earlier about diversity of opinion and consensus building and things like that, those are practical things that I think everybody needs to focus on. And I think they're things that would actually make a significant improvement to the world. Like I know we talked a lot about spirituality, and that's just like my personal view. And I think it's important to hear what everybody else has to say and just learn from them continuously. But but yeah, no, I think we covered a lot of ground. Um
Yeah, I
Uh,
wanted to take notes lots of time, and I was saying that might be rude. I'm like here taking notes. I need to be present.
yeah, no, like yeah, we haven't even scratched the surface. It's fine. But I like these kinds of conversations because it also gets me thinking about things differently, or perhaps the same. I don't know. Um, it's uh, I think it's important to have a clear path in your life. I really empathize with people who don't have that because it like having a sense of purpose in life is so crucial. It's um it could be a matter of life and death for some people. Like if you just don't have a reason for living, like I mean, that's about as serious as it gets. And I do know a lot of people who unfortunately, made that choice to end their life. And I also think about that when I think about all of this stuff. Like I think um, life is very precious, and I try to make the best of it every day. And and the only way I can do that is to be humble about what I'm doing and about everybody else around me. And yeah, I would just add that.
Thank you. I really appreciate you and everything that you brought today. So I'll go into the closing concept now. I am the place where life shines through, for life and I are one, not two. Life wants me where and as I am. I need not worry, fret, or plan. If I will be relaxed and free, life will carry out its work through me.